Hello everyone, I'm Lucas Pardue. I work for BBC R&D. So you've probably all heard of BBC, but not necessarily the R&D bit of it. So we're quite a broad-ranging body of people, lots of people like me looking at internet technologies or video technologies, and then UX people and sociologists or ergonomists and all sorts of stuff. That's just where I sit, is basically internet distribution with a focus on media distribution. And a lot of our work is around HTTP-based streaming formats like Dash or HLS, HDS, but really looking at Dash as the future format for streaming things. And that's really where my work focuses on, in the HTTP layer and web protocols. So that's why this talk is about browsers and non-browsers, as I learn more about this whole world working at the BBC and the complications of things. So, getting onto the talk, I came up with this title, and then when somebody in work asked me about what I was doing, I said the title, and they said, "Oh, like that horrible song." And I said, "Whoa, can't navigate." Right, there we go. And I said, no, it's not like that song. So I apologize for any offense caused by that title. It's more like this kind of thing where we'll come into the specifics of browser and non-browser, but there's so much kind of crossover between the two. Like, just talking about it gives me a headache. So I'll end this conversation, probably have a lie down. But to kind of put context around these things, a few months ago, the W3C Technical Architecture Group met in this very room and talked about a broad range of their topics dealt with at their face-to-face meeting. And I was sat in a position kind of over there. And yeah, one of the things they were talking about was the Evergreen Web. And I'll come on to kind of what that might mean. But yeah, it relates to this browser, non-browser thing that I'd kind of been looking at on my own in work anyway. So they published a specification, I call it, or document, and you can have a read. It's quite short, but one of the statements in there was that browsers that do not stay up to date place stress on the ecosystem. Some products support only a limited subset of the web platform. Vendors create these subsetted web runtimes for a number of reasons, intentionally and some stuff and unintentionally. But really what it's trying to get to is the idea around something called HBBTV, which is web browsers taking a more active role in, say, things like smart TVs, and that actually they're web browsers, but they're very strictly defined or subsetted for a number of things that they're doing. And the W3C doesn't necessarily think that's a great thing, because it can prevent evolution of technologies and uptake of new things, effectively reducing the lowest common denominator. So that's great. But then I asked the question, what is a web browser? Okay, and to horribly paraphrase Sir Tim Berners-Lee, he responded and said, they don't define what a browser is. And this is the guy that created the first web browser. And I came to this event hoping I might get a bit of clarity. And I just, yeah, I left early that night. Not because I had to catch a train, but yeah, that's what happened. But if you take a look at that document, actually, it is fair to this kind of blurred world. So there's a statement here. It's not actually attributed to Andrew, but I'll do it. I was hoping he'd be here to shout at me. But anyway, and it says vendors must decide whether their products can browse the public web. Products that can load arbitrary content are browsers, and they must be regularly updated, etc. So, I don't know what browsing the web is. There's some slides that I'll show you about other people exploring that topic, and it's really good. And I'd encourage you to think about what you think is a browser and what browsing the web is. But let's go to standards. I like those a lot. So IETF RFC 7230. Let's go back to basics a bit and think about HTTP and what the different users in that system are. So they define a client as something that establishes a connection for the purpose of sending one or more HTTP requests, and a server is something that accepts connections and services the requests and sends responses. And then you get things like proxies, which can act as both. They can do clever things. And as we get into application layer origin servers and server-side rendering, things again get really messy. So we'll come on to that in a bit. But what I've said there is RFC 72030. But actually, HTTP goes back quite far. And the original specifications they went through a phase of identifying what they'd spec'd, where the world was now, and trying to update those documents to reflect that. And that process took 7 years. It was a very difficult process. And in that kind of phase of work, they created a section to talk about implementation diversity. And so Mark Nottingham, the IETF HTTP Biz Working Group co-chair, was a part of that refactoring process. And his blog post effectively declares the old version dead, and this new version, the king or queen of those things. And on that blog post, it says people started using HTTP for things other than web browsing, our APIs, our RESTful stuff, and they began using the web itself in new ways. So there's a section in those RFCs now that say the term user agent refers to any of the various client programs that initiate a request, including but not limited to browsers, spiders, command line tools, custom applications, and mobile apps. So in the room, we might have people who use those in some ways. Curl or libcurl is typically the one that springs to mind for speaking to things like microservices, and they're growing. And so coming back to this, when considering the design of HTTP, it is easy to fall into that trap of thinking just all user agents being browsers and a user sat there actively clicking. That's not the case in practice. They come in different shapes and sizes. So some of the work at BBC R&D are looking at different ways people interact with these systems. So you've got our voice assistants and how we might talk to those machines, and you might have heard of something, the name escapes me right now, but it's just been launched about an interactive narrative drama thing with your home assistant. But we're looking at other ways of consuming media. So your smart device being able to dynamically switch, or this hybrid broadcast spectrum and dynamic insertion of content via IP and seamless transition between the both of them. Again, all HTTP-based media streaming. And then we've got something like the cook-along kitchen, which is more of an object-based, dynamic kind of adapting to you rather than a linear broadcast. And so in this space, there's a lot of good talks I've seen. Peter Gaston presented Growing Up, Getting Serious at State of the Browser 6. I've became aware of that just the other week. I think the event was just the other week. Actually, I found that really interesting because it was resonating with some of the ideas I've got. I'm not going to go into that. I'd encourage you to have a look, but it's exploring things like the idea of progressive web apps being based on a browser, but not necessarily being web browsing, or things like notifications. And your interaction with the service or a content provider is different, albeit based on the same kind of technologies. To go more low level, there's Daniel Stenberg, the author and maintainer of curl and libcurl. And he has some interesting blog posts about things like TLS and how, although you can look at a spec and implement it, actually the browsers with browser vendors with our resources are able to do a lot more clever things on the top. So when we're looking at certificate revocation lists and certificate authorities and all of the logic and business logic around that, it's implemented very well, but it's kind of secret source within the browser. And things like curl or wget aren't able to access that. And people who use those things aren't necessarily benefiting from those features. So this blog post was a kind of a call to encourage them to maybe open up or free some of that stuff. And Daniel's interesting because he does work for Mozilla. So it's kind of a renegade opinion within that establishment. So that's why I like it. But anyway, going back to user agents, what are they formed of? There was a paper published by Grosskirth and Godfrey in 2005, so 12 years ago, where they analyzed 2 browser implementations to try and come up with this reference architecture, look at what was common between them and how you might implement things. And they looked at Mozilla browser and Conqueror, if you remember those things. And they came up with these components, the user interface, the browser engine, rendering engine, networking, all that kind of things. And then they mapped that into those implementations. So looking at how you realize those functions. are they inside or outside or whatever? And you might recognize some things there. You know, NSS is still relevant. The rest of it, not so sure. They did the same for Lynx browser, if you're familiar with that. So you need to get away from the idea that it's all flashy graphics stuff. You know, it is a browser, but it renders in cursors. Go away and play with that. The publication is quite out of date. And actually, when I presented something similar, to the HTTP workshop people, one of the guys at Mozilla laughed at the XML parser component. Things were a bit weird then. But you know, trying to add some original thought to this area, you can think of something like Node and where that might fit into things. You know, it's the V8 JavaScript engine extracted out. This is a kind of high-level architecture, and then it glosses over a lot of details. But if you look at some of those kind of core components of Node and try to draw that reference architecture over things, you know, could you maybe create your own browser using Node? I don't know. I think you possibly could try. If you're looking at it through the lens of server-side rendering and trying to create a DOM and parse things and write things into it and read that back out, maybe. And it gets even more complicated if you think of things like Headless Chrome, which effectively removes that rendering engine component out of the reference architecture, but has everything underneath it with some caveats. And Electron too, kind of combining both of those things I've just talked about. So the message I'm just trying to get across is it's really hairy. So if anyone's got any insight into this, please let me know, because the further I dive, the more confused I get on this. So let's leave that there and let's talk about things more relevant to what I do. So looking at iPlayer and media streaming. I've got BBC iPlayer publishes a performance report which expresses different metrics. I'll just present a few here. Go and have a look if you fancy, but they've got a strange terminology where requests aren't HTTP requests, but they're the number of successful requests to stream or download a program. And streaming means play instantly, and download means save to your device. And to give you a feel for what the since 2009 is, our number of requests is growing. It's seasonal, so you'll see peaks and troughs. Troughs generally in the summer, and you know the month of July saw 236 million requests for TV programs to iPlayer. But you know, where are those things originating from? Is it people on their computer or on their phone? So the performance pack also breaks these things down by category. So TV devices, tablet, mobile, and computer. You can see that actually, you know, in the month of July, nearly 50% of those requests were from TV devices, not a browser, maybe. So, you know, that's not to say that those TV devices don't have a browser on them, but maybe they're subsetted and are breaking the rules of the Evergreen Web. It's really hard, and that information is within the BBC, I'm sure. It's hard to keep up to date, and I need to access those people and help. So presenting this talk is kind of my Trojan to talking to those guys too. So there's a bit of a test run for that. So feedback appreciated. So let's compare apples to oranges here. We've got proportions of like media streaming, and let's compare that to the UK market share for browsers or devices that browse the web, according to this website. And this is a really bad thing to do. Like, don't draw too many conclusions from it. But it shows you that for us, half of our requests being serviced to TV devices, and compared that to web browsing, it's desktop. So there's quite an inversion there. And when people effectively say it's all about browsing and web performance has to be about Chrome and Firefox, and these guys are doing that, that's for us just part of the picture. And to think about the kinds of devices we're trying to support, to break down these categories just a bit, we're looking at things like set-top boxes and smart TVs, Chromecasts, Fire Sticks, consoles. You can break the computer market down into Chrome and Edge, and Firefox, and different market shares here, and the different kinds of devices. And basically, as a public service broadcaster, we've got a mandate to maximize our audience reach. So it's not easy for us to say, we'll just ignore that because it's a small proportion of the market. we've got to try and develop technologies that are widespread. That's quite difficult. And to take that kind of distribution and think about different use cases for HTTP, I mean, I presented media streaming and maybe web browsing, but there's other forms, proxies and caches, and maybe how those are split across platforms and implementations, your scripts and your DevOps using command line tools, your apps that are doing like player interactions, maybe using WebSockets rather than HTTP, that kind of aspect of things, your microservices, your IoT and your assistants. You know, HTTP is great because it provides a very homogeneous layer for things to interact with, and that's why it's seen a lot of growth in it. But yeah, you end up with a whole different class of things trying to use it in different ways and with different requirements. And so some of the characteristics of those things compared to a browser, say, and this is just some, I'm sure there are many others, but you know, just to give you a flavor, there's no URL bar, there's no padlock, there's no expression of your security context in an easy to parse form, although you could argue that padlock is a really bad way of doing this. You know, if you're using curl and you get an error, you might just use it in insecure mode and just ignore that because I'll sort that out later. Or we're in a secure network and that will never affect us. Those are dangerous ways to think, but they're valid maybe. You've got no DOM, you've got same origin policy, cookies, just handling errors, like who do you show that error to? Is logging something good enough, or do you need to be reactive to it? How do you rectify that error? You've got limited devices. So, you know, we work with embedded clients. Part of the research project I work on, we have a Pi that, you know, we build a monolithic image for and bake in different HTTP command line clients in order to do streaming. We use GStreamer for the media pipeline element, but it's got pluggable HTTP client library. So, you know, we found the default libsoup, which is all right, wasn't featureful enough, so we replaced it ourselves with curl and fed that back. And yeah, but trying to support that becomes difficult because to update my Pi image, I've got to blow a whole new Pi image to the SD card and plug it in. That's the way we've chosen to do it, and it's not very good. But that's what embedded devices have. And there might be, you know, during that W3C tag meeting, there was an expression from one of the guys, I can't quite remember, who works with Sony and said that Sony are committed to updating their browser and keeping it up to date. But I'd like to see that. It'd be great. Prove me wrong, right? I don't know. And there's, you know, there's a lot. Sometimes there's multiple clients, so you'll have different, well, OEM solutions brought in to create a product that's integrated, and there's a handover between browsing a TV EPG and then activating the smart applications and using those to actually handing over to a media streaming application. So you end up with multiple things and they operate differently. And so within the BBC, we've got a whole team dedicated to testing all of these different kinds of things to catch errors, because there's not necessarily a standard that specifies those different classes and what are required. So there's lots of HTTP features in the world, but not necessarily a way to baseline what you implement. It's not about subsetting, but it's about a capability baseline. And that's kind of where some of my work in the future might be looking at, trying to write something that helps people define that. And, you know, this really comes to it. Is there a low-tech kind of can I use, or a can I use for HTTP features alone? Some of these are on there, but, you know, I would take this as a checklist. If I was trying to pick an implementation to realize a non-browsing thing, you know, a media streaming application, and I need to pick something, which of these does it support? I might not even need all of them, but it's difficult to tell. You could say I don't need TLS, but actually in that world of TLS everywhere, I will need it. I don't need proxy support until you have people behind a corporate proxy that want to test out that product, and then you suddenly do. So you either have to roll your own or switch product at the last moment. And on the TLS aspect of things, again, Daniel's blog on that is really, really interesting. I'd encourage you to look. So kind of whistled through that. And in closing, I'd like to go back to that Evergreen Web. So here's a different statement. Subsets and legacy browsers can hold the lowest common denominator down preventing the spread of platform-wide progress. The risk is magnified by use. More instances of subsetted browsers lead to a more heterogeneous web. Runtimes which are not general-purpose browsers do not see much use pose less risk. So you could argue that some of those use cases are not general-purpose browsing, but I don't know. I don't know what the definition of general-purpose browsing is. And if you look at Peter Gaston's presentation, he explores that and the changing ways that people are interacting with these services, and the idea that you sit here and type in URLs and make bookmarks, and it's kind of going away. So I'm interested in where the future is going to take us, and I'd just say go back to those features and what you think your implementation you use implements, and whether you fall into the category of subsetting or if you just feel left behind and there's nothing you can do to help that. Those projects have limited resources, and it'd be great if we could all contribute, but it's really hard. It's really hard to test, and yeah, they just get left behind. So that's all. Thank you.
That was a really interesting talk, so thank you very much for that, Lucas. Right, well, we do need to kind of move on, but we've got time for like a couple of questions this stage. There's like, obviously with a small crowd, there's plenty of time at the end for like, if you want individual questions, you can tap Lucas up for those. But anybody got anything they'd like to ask in front? Okay, I'll do one from you and one from you.
Is this improving, or so you know the guy from Sony, he says they're making like, are new devices essentially are there legacy devices being introduced all of the time, or is there light at the end of the tunnel, I suppose? Like, do the new devices update themselves? Do they actually do that?
Is that plugged in? or connected to?
All I'm saying is my LG smart TV definitely doesn't. So,
no, mine updates and removes features. It's very complicated, and I don't want to speak out turn. Like, I'm within R&D, I maybe don't have as much exposure to that, day in, day out, understanding those things. If I've got sympathy for those people trying to implement stuff, and that you've got a product roadmap, and it can be. Okay. It can be difficult, and you might not have access to source code to even update that thing or have an update mechanism. You might have seen something recently where Samsung TVs updated their firmware and got bricked, and there was no way to recover other than booking it into a Samsung service center. I don't know the reason for that firmware update. You could say it's just a regular thing, and we're just keeping the browser up to date. I mean, I think the difference is that it's not a computer where somebody's kind of running it day in, day out, and these things are updating in the background. It's quite a big change, and there's risk there. So I would hope that as the industry moves towards more of an IP-focused way of doing things, that they kind of are able to adopt that way of working, and that specifications for doing media improve more rapidly rather than these kind of 10-year views on things. But I don't know. They need to work towards it, I think, and having those pressures helps.
That was a great talk. Thank you very much. So I have one question, but it's actually two, so I'm going to annoy Perry by asking two because they segue into each other. So my first question is, and you tried to avoid this question, although because you said that you were confused, that you don't know. Do you now, after all of your research, have a definition of what you think a browser should be defined as?
I'd say a loose one, and you could argue that it's about really having kind of like a paint method. So building a DOM, recursing through things, and having a final call where you paint things to a screen that's viewed by a user.
But surely curl paints to a screen, right? It just pipes to standard out rather than...
It does, but in a contextless way.
Yeah.
So it doesn't try to understand the contents.
Yeah.
Talking very high level. You could argue that you can build your browser using libcurl because you can then add context to it. I don't feel I've got a strong definition, and I'm trying to build towards that. In a way, I don't think it's black and white. I think there's levels of capability. So I think I might be able to implement lots of stuff HTTP-wise and not a rendering engine, but create an output that can be fed into a rendering engine. And like, there's a use case I've got for this, which I haven't got enough time to get into, but yeah, we can talk after if you like.
And so I was playing devil's advocate there, and I definitely agree with you. So my follow-up question is, and what you alluded to towards the end is more of just HTTP client, regardless of the rendering tier bit, the browser definition, or more just HTTP clients. Do you think then, and with Daniel Steinberg's checklist that you put at the end?
But that was my checklist.
Oh, that was your checklist.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I saw his.
Yeah.
No, I loved the checklist, and I took a photo of it. So my follow-up question is, do you think, at least to that low level, that the IETF or HTTP specifications, RFCs, should have a definition of what you need to be as to classify as a HTTP client? Or do you think that the specs are there to be interpreted like most specs are, and actually that's the beauty of the web and what we call IP, and actually there shouldn't be a definition. Or do you think
I think there should be. So I'm going to try and write something that starts that, and it'll be a personal draft, and we'll see if other people in the HTTP working group agree to that. So that's my plan. And if the feedback is no, then that's great. But within my world of work, I need to speak to people within the R&D, because there's people who work on HBBTV, and there's people who are working with just Assistant, and there's a lot of information I can get access to and feed that back. Because they say stuff like, you must support HTTP redirects. You would think, of course you would, but there are devices that don't, and we found them, and that's affected our rollout of product, and we've had to mitigate that in certain ways. So.
No, yeah, it's definitely stung the internet a lot. Safari supported HTTP 1.1 pipelining, and no one else did, and devices started. And so I think, at least as you say, that avoids the Samsung IoT land. At least you have to conform to a certain standard.
Okay, yep, thank you.
Okay, thanks once again to Lucas.